I've worked as an independent land surveyor for nearly 15 years. Most of my jobs take me deep into remote areas, often completely alone. I usually spend days out there, far from anyone else. I've always preferred that kind of isolation, at least I did before this happened. This took place around 4 years ago. I'd been assigned to check boundary markers on a property located in the mountainous region near Bitterroot Valley, Montana. Calling it remote would be an understatement. It took me roughly 6 miles of hiking just to reach the spot where I set up camp. As usual, I logged my route with the nearest ranger station and brought enough supplies for a full week. The first day went smoothly. I located 3 markers, recorded everything, and returned to camp before nightfall. The weather forecast predicted cold temperatures with light snowfall, which is exactly what I experienced. However, by the second day, conditions started getting worse. The snowfall was much heavier than expected. The next marker I needed to check was only about a mile away. Instead of stopping for the day, I decided to push forward. Looking back, that decision was a huge mistake. I still regret not staying put or heading back while I had the chance. The ground was covered in fresh snow, hiding rocks and icy slopes underneath, basically the worst terrain possible for hiking. While making my way down a small slope, my foot suddenly slipped on a patch of ice I hadn't noticed. One wrong step like that can be fatal, and I'm not exaggerating. I slid nearly 15 feet before managing to grab onto a tree root and stop myself. I was lucky it didn't get worse, but I immediately felt sharp pain in my right ankle. I tried to convince myself it wasn't serious, but the moment I stood up, couldn't hide the pain. I could barely put weight on that leg, and I knew it would take hours before I could walk properly again. I was frustrated with myself, but there was nothing I could do. I decided to abandon the rest of the work. No job is worth getting stranded out there. I slowly made my way back uphill toward the main trail and started heading back to camp. After a while, I noticed a set of boot prints on the trail. They seemed to come from deeper within the forest on my left side. The prints were heading in the same direction I was going and looked relatively fresh, judging by how defined they were despite the snowfall. I assumed it might be a hunter or someone working for the landowner. Even in remote areas, it's not unusual to run into people occasionally, so I didn't think much of it. I continued walking carefully, trying to avoid putting too much pressure on my ankle. As daylight began to fade, I started hearing noises behind me. At first, I brushed it off as normal forest sounds, but the more I listened, the more it resembled footsteps. I kept turning around, scanning the area, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was dense enough that visibility was limited anyway. If something was following me, there was a good chance I wouldn't spot it. When I stopped walking, the sound stopped too, but not immediately. There was a slight delay, maybe a second or two. That detail made me uneasy. I stood still, listening carefully, but all I could hear was wind and falling snow. When I started walking again, the sound didn't return right away, which made me think everything was fine. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, footsteps behind me. That's when things started to feel seriously wrong. I knew if something or someone attacked me, I wouldn't be able to run. That was the scariest part. I couldn't even properly defend myself in my condition. Then I heard something unusual, a metallic noise coming from my left. It sounded like something lightly hitting metal, maybe equipment or a pole. That didn't make sense because there shouldn't have been anything like that out there. The sound distracted me, and I suddenly realized I had lost track of the footprints I had been following. When I looked down, they were gone. I turned around, trying to figure out where they had gone, whether they had turned back or moved off the trail, but I couldn't find any clear sign. As I scanned the trees to my left, trying to locate the source of the sound, I noticed something that made my heart drop. There was another set of footprints emerging from the tree line, moving parallel to mine. They weren't far away at all. Whoever had been ahead of me on the trail was now walking alongside me, hidden among the trees. At that moment, I panicked. Instead of staying quiet and moving on, I made the mistake of calling out, asking if anyone was there. There was no response. After waiting for about 20 seconds, I knew I needed to leave as quickly as possible. but my injured ankle made that nearly impossible. I couldn't run or even jog. I was close to camp though. I kept telling myself that if I could just make it back, I'd be safe. The footsteps behind me stopped, but I knew someone was still out there. Just before reaching my campsite, I heard a loud crack behind me, like a heavy branch snapping. It didn't sound natural. I didn't stop. I just kept moving. Eventually, I reached my camp. It was completely dark by then, but even inside my tent, I didn't feel safe. I immediately started packing. Moving quickly with my injured ankle was difficult, but I forced myself to hurry. Then I heard it. Footsteps, right outside my tent. They weren't coming closer, they were circling around it. I froze, waiting for something to happen. It felt like it went on for several minutes before everything suddenly went silent. I didn't wait any longer. I finished packing, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The moment I looked toward the trees, I screamed. There was a man standing there, watching me. He looked extremely old and sick, almost like he was on the verge of death. His appearance was disturbing. I raised my hands and told him I didn't want any trouble. He didn't respond. We just stared at each other. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. "You're a lucky man." Then he turned and disappeared into the forest. The rest of that night is a blur. Between the pain in my ankle and what had just happened, I wasn't thinking clearly. If that man had wanted to hurt me, I wouldn't have been able to stop him. I packed everything and left, even though it was still dark. Later, I was told I had badly sprained my ankle, and it was a miracle it wasn't worse. I reported the incident, but nothing ever came of it. I didn't take another winter job for nearly a year. I still work in remote areas. It's what I do, but I no longer camp alone during winter assignments. Now, I either bring someone with me or decline the job entirely. This remains the most terrifying experience of my life. I've lived in Canada most of my life. My family moved to Whitehorse when I was 6 and I never really left. I spent my summers working fish camps as a teenager, started guiding professionally in my early 20s. It's basically been my life ever since. I'm 29 now. I work seasonally as a wilderness guide in northern Yukon, and I've been doing it long enough that I don't really get rattled much out there. I don't get lost, or I guess I should say, I didn't think I could get lost because what happened 3 years ago kind of forced me to reconsider that. My boyfriend at the time was Daniel. He grew up in rural Alberta and was basically the male version of me when it came to the outdoors. Actually, that's not really fair to him because he was probably more experienced than me in certain areas, like winter navigation specifically. We'd been together about 4 years, and most of our relationship revolved around trips that would make normal couples absolutely miserable. Week-long hunts and backcountry camping where you actually have to plan or you'll die. That sounds dramatic, but it's literally true up here. The plan was to snowmobile between 2 state-registered cabins about 60 miles apart. We'd spend a night at each and be back home in 4 days. We'd done the exact trip twice before, and it was always fine. The weather forecast looked good when we left, so we weren't worried at all. The first day was completely uneventful. We got to the second cabin by late afternoon, ate these freeze-dried meals that Daniel swore tasted good but were honestly terrible, and then we played cards. It was a pretty relaxing evening. The next morning I woke up and realized there was a genuine storm going on outside. It was basically a full-on blizzard that came out of nowhere, which was super surprising given the fact that there had been nothing indicating precipitation in the weather forecast. Daniel and I decided to brave the storm despite the fact that we had plenty of food and could have totally waited another day. We should have waited another day. I know that now. Things went south really quickly. The wind was almost worse than the snow. It was really hard to see much of anything, so Daniel opted to take the lead. I was just following the path of his snowmobile, which was admittedly a lot easier than navigating the terrain in low visibility without anything in front of me, which is why I don't blame him for what happened. I don't really know how it happened, but one second, Daniel was just plodding along, and the next, his snowmobile was on top of him. I jumped off mine and ran over to him, but it was too late. His leg was bent in a way legs should not bend. Keep in mind, this was a guy who had once finished a 2-day trek on a sprained ankle and didn't even mention it until we were back at the truck. The first thing I tried was getting him on my snowmobile. That was the obvious move. Just get him on the back and ride us both to the cabin. But Daniel's 6 feet 2 inches and probably 220 at the time, and those aren't like ATVs where you can just throw someone on the back and go. A ski-doo in deep snow is already a lot of machine to handle by yourself. I got him up once, kind of half dragged him onto the seat behind me, and he lasted maybe 10 seconds before he slid off the side. The sound he made when he hit the ground is something I never want to hear again. I tried one more time and it was worse. He couldn't grip with his legs at all, and every time the machine shifted even slightly, he'd start to go and there was nothing I could do to hold him and steer at the same time. After the second attempt, he told me to stop, and the way he said it, he wasn't asking, he was telling me. That's when we both kind of accepted what the actual plan was going to have to be. I pulled out the satellite phone, and my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I actually managed to get a connection after a few tries, but I wasn't sure if my message about our coordinates and where we were got through. Relying on someone else to come save Daniel was a terrible idea, and we both knew it. I knew it had to happen. I'd leave him sheltered with everything we had, then take my snowmobile and push for the nearest cabin to use the emergency radio. There wasn't really a discussion about it. Daniel just looked at me and I looked at him, and that was it. I got him set up with every extra layer we had and marked our coordinates on my GPS. He told me to be careful, and then he told me not to do anything stupid, and then I just left him there in the snow. I was navigating mostly by feel and GPS, but the circumstances seemed so dire that I was having trouble not freaking out. After about 45 minutes, things started feeling off, like landmarks weren't matching up and the terrain didn't look right. I kept telling myself it was the snow messing with my perception, but the feeling just got worse and worse, and then I saw smoke through the trees to my left. I angled toward it thinking I somehow looped back to one of the cabins, but the structure didn't match either one. It was smaller and kind of ugly, honestly, with one side almost buried in a snowdrift. There was a faint glow from inside, and the smoke was coming from the chimney. At that point, I just realized smoke meant a person, and a person meant a radio, or at least a way to warm up enough to keep going. I killed the engine and trudged through the snow over to the door. I knocked a few times, expecting someone to come over and open the door, but no one did. So I tried the door handle and realized it was unlocked. I walked in and was kind of surprised to discover that it was really warm in there. It was definitely inhabited. There was a wood stove in the corner with a fire going and a bedroll on the floor. There was also a can of some kind of food on the floor with a spoon still in it. It honestly looked like whoever was living in there had walked out the door 5 minutes before I came in. I announced my presence, but no one answered. So I just stood there warming my hands and trying the satellite phone again. But I had no luck, which was pretty disheartening. Still though, I didn't want to go back into those treacherous conditions yet. But I had to. Daniel's life was depending on it. As I was turning to leave, I noticed something sitting on the shelf on the back wall. I walked over to it and realized it was a pair of binoculars along with a folded map in a notebook. I unfolded the map and realized it was a trail map of the area we'd been riding through. Sections of it were circled in marker and I recognized some of them, 2 of them specifically. Both of the cabins we'd been staying at were circled and there were dates written next to them in pencil. Some were from that winter, some were from the winter before that, and so on. I picked up the notebook and realized whoever it belonged to had been documenting people. There were descriptions of people like what they were wearing, what direction they were headed, that sort of thing. I was instantly really unsettled. There was a good chance Daniel and I were somewhere in that notebook, but I wasn't sticking around to check. I don't really know how to tell you what it felt like. It wasn't fear right away. It was more like everything in the cabin suddenly felt wrong. I put everything down and went straight to the door. But before I could reach the door handle, I heard the loudest and scariest scream I've ever heard. It came from below me, under the floor. It was a woman, and they weren't saying anything, just screaming at the top of their lungs like they were getting stabbed. The shock made me literally jump, and I just ran for the door. I started my snowmobile as fast as I could and rode out of there without even looking back. I never got another glimpse of the cabin. I was a total mess after that, to the point where I don't really remember the rest of the journey. At some point, I made it to the real cabin and got through on the emergency radio. They had to dispatch a helicopter just to make it to Daniel, and he was near death. Hypothermic for one, and his leg was in terrible shape, but he was alive and conscious. The rest continues unchanged in structure and wording. When I was a junior in high school, there was this girl I spent a lot of time thinking about. Her name was Aria Bennett. She had this alluring presence about her that's kind of hard to explain, but I'll try my best. She was really pretty, of course, but it was more than that. She had this mystique that I could never decipher, a mystique that you wouldn't typically associate with a generic pretty girl. She wasn't popular, and I got the impression that a lot of guys, girls too, were more intimidated by her than anything else. She wasn't warm, and she didn't smile, and most people regarded her as weird. I didn't. I actually found her uniqueness kind of fascinating. Catching eyes with her would freeze me up, kind of like the way your body adjusts to a cold room or an unexpected gust of wind. She reminded me of snow, honestly. The way that a light snowfall can muffle everything around you, including your own thoughts. She had that quality, but it was like no one noticed but me. People just thought the way she kept to herself or never spoke was weird, but I was always dying to know what she was thinking. I read a lot of young adult fantasy novels around that time, so that probably had something to do with it. I wrote a lot around that time too. I actually named one of the characters in a story I was writing Aria. You could say I was obsessed, but I also just liked that name. Anyway, I was walking up the stairs with my friend Marcus one day, talking about that exact story, when he asked me what the characters' names were. So I told him, and of course, as soon as I mentioned the name Aria, who turns the corner but the actual Aria walking with one of her friends. She flashed me a smirk, the closest thing to a smile you could get out of her, and she said, "Yeah, because you love me," or something along those lines. I was so embarrassed, and Marcus started laughing, which made it even worse. She was already moving past me, clearly not interested in continuing the conversation, and my window was closing. I don't know what came over me, but right there on the spot, I asked her out. That actually got her to stop, and she gave me one of her famous icy stares. She didn't even have to speak. Her eyes communicated everything. How dare you even ask me that? But then she surprised me. She actually agreed and gave me her number. Then she said she'd text me and walked away, not even letting me respond. I was shocked, but that's how I ended up going on a hike with the girl I was obsessing over for months. The hike wasn't my idea, by the way. None of it was. She organized it all, and I got the impression that I had no choice but to go along with whatever she wanted. And I was fine with that. So fast forward to the weekend, and Aria's driving us out to this trail she picked. I'd never been to it, and neither had anyone I knew. The drive was about 45 minutes, but it felt like 10 because I was so in my head. Aria had her window down and was playing music from her phone, stuff I didn't recognize, which tracked. We pulled into this gravel lot at the base of the trail. There were maybe 2 other cars there. Aria didn't even think twice. She just started walking, and I followed. For the first 20 minutes or so, things were actually great. Aria was more talkative than I'd ever seen her, which admittedly still wasn't that talkative. But for her, it was a lot. She asked me about the story I was writing, which was kind of embarrassing, but I gave her a rough summary while not trying to sound like an idiot. The trail narrowed after a while and the trees got denser. We hadn't seen another person since the parking lot. At some point, the trail split into a fork. I asked Aria which way, and she pointed left without hesitating. I asked her if she'd been here before, and she said no. I found that a little strange, especially considering how definitive she seemed to be about everything. But I didn't say anything. The left fork was noticeably less maintained. I started to get the feeling we were going the wrong way, but I wasn't going to question her. I must have been really in my head about that, because at one point, I realized I couldn't hear Aria's footsteps behind me anymore. The trail had gotten so narrow that we were walking single file, and I had taken the lead since she had gestured me to go first. But when I turned around to check on her, she wasn't there. The trail behind me was empty. I yelled her name, but I didn't get a response. I was confused, so I started walking back the way we had come. I made it back to the fork, and she wasn't there either. I figured she had probably stopped to use the bathroom and didn't want me to notice, which was a reasonable enough explanation. But I looked around some more and realized there was no side trail for her to wander off on. She was just gone. So I decided to try the right fork. To my surprise, that side was even more overgrown, and the further I walked, the less it felt like a real trail. I kept calling her name like an idiot, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't imagine why she would have abandoned me. At one point, I heard a branch snap somewhere off to my left, deeper in the trees, and then when I looked over, I saw a movement. Something shifted behind one of the thicker trees. I instantly knew what was going on. It was Aria messing with me. That would have been on brand for her. So I figured I'd turn the tables on her and surprise her before she could surprise me. I slowly walked over to the tree as quietly as I could, and at the last second, I jumped to the side to scare her. But as I was mid-yell, I realized it wasn't Aria. It was a man. I was horrified, but it was too late. I was inches away from this tall, middle-aged looking man who didn't seem scared in the slightest. I instinctively took a few steps backward, and the guy just stared at me. Before he could say anything, I blurted out that I was just looking for my friend or something like that. He clearly didn't care. He started walking towards me, so I turned and started walking back toward the trail, trying not to run. But then I heard a second sound, this time from my right. I looked over and saw another person moving through the woods. The second guy wasn't even trying to hide. He was just standing in the open watching me, and he was holding what looked like a tree branch in his hand. That's when I just ran. The second guy was blocking the path back to the trail, so I was just running through the woods with no real sense of direction. As soon as I started running, both men started running after me. Before I could react, something grabbed my ankle and I fell. It was the first guy and he was trying to pin me down. I screamed and kicked and somehow managed to get free. I got up and kept running. My mouth was full of blood at that point. I don't think they followed me after that, but I didn't care. I ran until I found the trail, then kept running until I made it back to the parking lot. Aria's car was still there, but the other two cars were gone. Aria wasn't anywhere in sight. I thought those men had taken her. I called her phone over and over, but she didn't answer. Just as I was about to call the police, she texted asking where I had gone. Then I saw her walking out of the trees like nothing happened. We left together, but something felt wrong the entire time. We never spoke again after that day.